Thank you very much. I'm actually going to broaden my remarks beyond plants to biodiversity, having thought about it better. Before I begin, I'd just like to say that although we're not supposed to be any kind of a guide to spirituality or human charity in here, but rather a scientific and technical organization, there's something about hearing that $2.5 trillion is being spent annually on cancer in the very advanced nations, given the needs of the world, that I'm going to say something about that nevertheless bothers me a bit. We don't think much about the loss of biodiversity, and yet in many ways it's the most serious problem that we're facing. And the reason it's the most serious problem that we're facing is because we depend entirely on the other living organisms in the world for our food, for our support, for regulating the environment, and indeed for our life. And the difference between it and all the other problems, even global warming, which can drive biodiversity to extinction much more rapidly, as I'll emphasize in a minute, all the other problems are in the long run reversible. The loss of biodiversity is not reversible. And it seems to me that Genesis 2:15, reading, "The Lord God took the man and settled him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it," we're doing a pretty awful job of that, and we really need to think about that, because once biodiversity is gone, it's gone. There's nothing to replace it. There's no other place to go to find food. We base all our food on plants, directly or indirectly. There's no place to go to find the unusual molecules that support our medicines. And even in terms of the complex molecular biology that's being worked out these days, we need other organisms to find other forms of genes transcription and so forth, which people like Mark Van Montague and others who are deeply into the field find are often much more complicated and surprising than they imagine when we get into organisms that haven't been investigated before. Now, I would also say, in talking about biodiversity, that we've had a good symposium on biological extinction last April 2017, which is about to be published in the next few months by Cambridge University Press. And our president, who's unfortunately absent, is organizing another symposium on the Noah's Ark approach to biodiversity to be held next spring. And in addition, many of our environmental study weeks here are touching seriously on biodiversity. Our species, Homo sapiens, is at least 300,000 years old, but we didn't really begin to inflict damage on the earth until about 11,000 years ago, when we invented crop agriculture, bringing in the grains that we gathered in the wild, that our ancestors gathered in the wild previously, bringing them in and cultivating them. At that point, 11,000 years ago, in other words, something like 400 to 500 generations ago, the entire human population of the world amounted to about 1 million people, and the population of Europe amounted to about 100,000 people. In other words, about the number that would fill a large sports stadium at the present time. Now, when you can say we've grown from that in 11,000 years in the 4.5 billion year history of the Earth, you're saying something pretty remarkable. In 1562, when this building was first constructed, there were about 500 million people in the entire world, about the current population of Europe, but they were consuming at a wholly lower rate. Now there are, as has been remarked several times, 7.6 billion of us, growing by 220,000 a day, and projected to reach 9.9 billion in 30 years. All of the wonderful technical advances that we are talking about have to be understood against the social background of the world. I like very much the idea of political capital, in other words, how we connect to one another. And unfortunately, if you look at that kind of political capital, whether it be the EU, the United Nations, the NATO, or any other kind of treaty pacts with one another, you find it disintegrating rapidly at the present time in the face of rampant nationalism. Even though the wealthy countries of the world are using far more than their share of what the world can produce, they're trying to get even richer and richer. As Mussolini said when he assumed office in 1932, it's time to make Italy great again. That means get more from other places. When Donald Trump says it's time to make America great again, he means exactly the same thing. He doesn't mean that $2.5 trillion research in cancer is going to benefit the poor people living in Africa. We can't really live in a world with the enormous inequity that we have at the present time because it's not sustainable. In the entire world, Oxfam has estimated that 8 individuals, 6 of them in the United States, possess as much wealth as the poorest 3.6 billion people on Earth. The idea of doing unto the poor is a good thing to do seems to have kind of vanished. We seem to have entered a world of doing unto ourselves with as much richness as we can possibly imagine. According to the Global Footprint Network website, which I strongly encourage you to look at, we're using about 175% of what the world can produce sustainably at the present time, 175%. If we had 75% more of the earth, we'd be able to go on living as we are sustainably instead of passing our sustainable capacity on what Mathis Wackernagel and his colleagues call Earth Overshoot Day, which was August 1st this year, by which time we'd used up all the sustainable productivity that there is. A lot of that is due to the overuse of fossil fuels. And to talk about fossil fuels going on and on, even switching to natural gas and so forth, is really a non-starter because, as Dr. Schnellenberger and many others have illustrated so well, there's every possibility of a breakaway cataclysmic event. And even in the absence of that, virtually no one, I think he said Morocco was the only one, is living up even to the Paris agreements, which would not limit the world warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. And that's a lasting problem. And as I'll say in a minute, it's a big problem for biodiversity as well as for us. The role of the Catholic Church in this environmental disaster that we've caused for ourselves has been very strong. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, realized that the Industrial Revolution, which had been roaring since about 1840, was impoverishing a lot of people, enriching other people in a very unequal way. As the global population has swept up from its Napoleonic level of about 1 billion total to 7.6 billion on the way to 9.8 billion, in other words, in 200 years, we've killed about 200 million people in war, and that is an example pretty much directly of people trying to get more than what other people have. Selfishness and nationalism, which are so well demonstrated in the Bible, are rampant at the present day, are growing in strength in most governments of rich industrial countries, and it's probably understandable when you think that those countries are all living beyond their means in the sense of they're taking more than their share of global productivity, and so many other countries in the world are living below their needs, as for example, 20 of the 24 poorest countries of the world, which are in sub-Saharan Africa, at least 8 of them have been dropping in income every year, and as they drop, they're reaching a point where they have nothing to sell, and they're getting into a state of pure exploitation with little hope from the outside. And you have to ask, since countries are so nationalistic and really greedy, when the rich countries of the world, for example, if we all consumed at the level of Austria, just to use a random example, we would need 3 copies of the planet Earth to support us if we all lived at that level. And if we added the 75% that I was talking about a minute ago, we'd still have 800 million people going to bed hungry and living in poverty. When 8 individuals control as much as 3.6 billion individuals, the kind of inequality that simply doesn't work has simply gone too far. Pope Francis in Laudato Si laid out a concise section on biodiversity, and although his predecessors from the time of the Stockholm Conference in 1971, the first notice of the necessity for global environmental action, Pope St. Paul VI participated very actively. And actually, in the years since 1971, the Catholic Church has been more active in the environment and the social justice consequences of the environment on one another than virtually any government on earth. Governments on earth are generally put in place to grasp for more money for the people living in those countries and dish it out, and not to look to social justice worldwide, whereas the church has the advantage of taking a broader view, a higher level view, a more moral view, as we heard Pope Francis emphasize this morning. Countries are trying hard, as the encyclical Laudato Si points out, in some cases to preserve their biodiversity, but when countries are dirt poor, like virtually all the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, they have no money to preserve their biodiversity with. It's fine for us all to lay out high-level principles about why they should do so and why that would be an advantage for us. But what we have to do is look for the time when we would begin to give up some of our own grasped riches to help to enable them to do that in the kind of spirit of partnership and fraternity that the Pope laid out for us this morning. One of the huge problems about biodiversity is that discounting the bacteria, which nobody has the slightest idea how many there are about 10 million species of organisms in the world, and only about 1.7 million of them have even been given a scientific name. So the species that we're losing at a rate that I'll talk about in a minute, the vast majority of them are unknown, and certainly with the greater concentration of species and more unknown species in the tropics, we can be certain that felling the 25% of tropical forest that's occurred since the passing of the much touted Convention on Biological Diversity, 25 years, 25% of the tropical forests, that on the average something like 19 out of 20 of the species in that forest had never been seen by science. You can calculate extinction rates either on comparing present demonstrated rates in well-known groups like terrestrial vertebrates and plants with historical rates measured in the fossil record, or you can, in which case, you get about 1,000 times the background rate for mammals, for plants and all that's existed during the time since the dinosaurs went extinct. Or you can think about extinction in terms of the species that are listed as endangered or imperiled by the International Convention, International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, which is 20%. If the rate calculated by comparison with the fossil record were to continue, we could lose about 50,000 species over the next 40 years. But if, given the acceleration of all the activities that are driving the species of the world to extinction, the rate predicted from the numbers in the IUCN, we would be losing about 10 times that much in the next 40 years. In other words, we could be losing 2 million species well before the end of the present century. Since the invention of agriculture, the biggest threat to species has been cultivation and the spread of agriculture. we're not making up the food that we need between now and mid-century to feed the 800 million hungry people in the world, but we're trying. Natural habitats everywhere are being destroyed as that goes along. Weeds, pests, and pathogens are being introduced worldwide. People gathering goods in natural habitats is a serious cause. And then we have global warming, where it all depends on how extreme the events are and what kind of turn the situation takes. Certainly, looking at the past and the kind of levels of anoxia in the oceans and other things that we've experienced, we can predict that any surprise in global warming caused by our carelessness and our selfishness is likely to be disastrous for biological diversity. We can really probably counter this only by a spirit of charity towards one another. Achieving the goals that we're talking about have to be a matter of common responsibility, and the rich countries of the world cannot simply go on gathering as much money, research, goods, and everything as possible. For a country like China, or historically the United States or Britain, to spread its tentacles all over the world and be gathering in goods from countries that are, many of which are now getting to be on the brink of environmental disaster, doesn't work, because they will fail too eventually, and what we're taking away from the total is much more than is there. I would just close with a quotation from Pope Francis from Laudato Si. He said, "Because all creatures are connected, each must be cherished with love and respect, for all of us as living creatures are dependent on one another." Thank you.